Today we uncover the chilling story of Joshua Jacobs, a 19-year-old boy from a small town in Kentucky. What began as an innocent relationship between a devoted altar boy and the wife of the local priest spiraled into a shocking affair that ended in tragedy. This is the story of how Joshua's secret relationship with 69-year-old Ruth Anderson, a woman who helped raise him, led to betrayal, murder, and devastation in a once peaceful community. Joshua Jacobs had always been a quiet, thoughtful boy, one who often found solace in the company of adults more than his peers. His mother had passed away when he was only 3 years old, and the memories of her were faint, like a distant dream. He knew her only through the stories his father told him, and through the few faded photographs that still hung on the walls of their small home. His father, Henry Jacobs, had been a good man, but was burdened with the heavy responsibility of raising Joshua alone, while also managing a demanding career as a traveling salesman. Henry's job kept him on the road for weeks at a time, forcing him to rely on friends and neighbors to help care for his young son. Among those neighbors was Ruth Anderson. Ruth was the wife of Pastor Joseph Anderson, the local priest of the town's small church. She was known in the community as a kind-hearted, generous woman who often opened her home to those in need. Ruth had no children of her own, and perhaps that was why she had taken such a special interest in Joshua when Henry first asked her to watch over him during his long trips. Ruth, despite being in her early 50s at the time, carried herself with the grace and beauty of someone much younger. She had an elegant presence, with her tall frame, curvaceous figure, and a face that still held the remnants of youth. For Joshua, Ruth was more than just a caretaker. She became a mother figure, filling the void left by his own mother's passing. She taught him the things a mother would, from tying his shoes to saying his prayers before bed. Ruth's home, filled with the smell of baked bread and the warm, comforting hum of hymns playing softly in the background, became a second home for Joshua. As a child, he spent countless afternoons sitting at her kitchen table, doing his homework while Ruth cooked, or playing with the small wooden toys that Pastor Joseph had carved for him. Joshua's connection to Ruth grew over the years. She encouraged his involvement in the church, where he began serving as an altar boy at the age of 8. It was here, in the sacred quiet of the church, that Joshua found purpose and belonging. Pastor Joseph treated him with the same affection he showed his own congregation, and for years, Joshua considered the Andersons to be the family he never truly had. As he grew older, Joshua blossomed into a thoughtful and intelligent young man. By the time he turned 19 in 2012, he was still deeply involved in the church, and his life remained intertwined with the Anderson family. Ruth had aged gracefully, her youthful beauty still evident. The women in town often envied her striking figure, particularly her curvaceous hips and full, rounded buttocks, which made her stand out even in her older years. Her face, though lined with the years, retained a softness that made her seem much younger than her age. Joshua had never thought of Ruth as anything more than a maternal figure, a woman who had been there for him through all the milestones of his life. But as he entered the confusing and tumultuous period of late adolescence, something inside him began to change. He had grown up around Ruth, and as a child, he had always found her presence comforting, like a warm embrace. But now, at 19, he began to notice things about her that he hadn't before. The way her hips swayed as she moved, the softness of her voice, and the way she seemed to glow with a vitality that defied her age. It was a hot summer evening in June 2012 when everything shifted for Joshua. He had stopped by Ruth's house after church, as he often did, to help her with some household chores. Pastor Joseph was away at a church conference, and Joshua, as usual, had agreed to keep Ruth company and assist her with anything she needed. Ruth had always been grateful for his help, but that night something was different. When Joshua arrived, Ruth greeted him at the door, wearing a pair of tight shorts and a thin singlet. Joshua had seen her in casual clothes before, but tonight the sight of her in those form-fitting shorts caught him off guard. As they went about their tasks, Joshua found it harder and harder to keep his eyes from wandering. Ruth's body, once a source of maternal warmth, now stirred something unfamiliar in him. Her movements seemed to slow, her voice seemed softer, and Joshua couldn't help but notice the way the shorts hugged her hips. It was an innocent scene. Ruth moving about the house, her usual friendly self. But to Joshua, it felt like the air had shifted, as if the very atmosphere in the room had thickened with tension. Joshua felt a heat rise in him that he didn't understand. His pulse quickened, and before he could stop it, he felt a rush of arousal that both shocked and horrified him. He had never looked at Ruth in this way before. She was beautiful, yes, but she had always been like a second mother to him. Yet here he was, unable to control the physical response that overtook him. Embarrassment surged through him as he realized he had an erection, something he had never experienced in Ruth's presence. He excused himself quickly, stumbling over his words, desperate to get out of the house before Ruth could notice his discomfort. His heart raced as he left, shame and confusion battling in his mind. How could he feel this way about her? He hurried home, hoping to forget what had just happened, but the memory of her figure lingered in his mind. Ruth, though outwardly calm, had sensed something had shifted between them. She was no stranger to the power her beauty held over men, even in her older age, and she had noticed the way Joshua's eyes had lingered on her that evening. It wasn't the first time she had felt the gaze of a younger man, but this was different. This was Joshua, someone she had cared for, like her own. And yet, there was something about the way he had looked at her that excited her, awakening feelings that she had long thought buried. Ruth spent the evening in quiet reflection after Joshua had rushed out of her house. She felt a strange mixture of emotions, surprise, excitement, and a deep longing that had been dormant for years. Pastor Joseph had grown distant over the years, more focused on his role in the church than on their marriage. Their intimacy had faded, leaving Ruth feeling neglected, her needs ignored. But Joshua's reaction to her earlier that day stirred something in her that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had raised Joshua from the time he was just a little boy, taking care of him as if he were her own. She remembered him sitting at her kitchen table, his legs dangling from the chair, smiling as he ate the cookies she made. In many ways, she had been like a mother to him. But now, things were different. Joshua was no longer a child. He was a man. And his attraction to her reminded her of her own desirability, something she hadn't thought about in years. That evening, as she prepared for bed, her thoughts kept returning to the way Joshua had looked at her. She felt a warmth spreading through her as she realized that he had found her beautiful, desirable, and that made her feel alive again. Later that night, Ruth decided to call Joshua. It was late, the house was quiet, and the sounds of the night crept in through the open windows. She dialed his number, her hands trembling slightly, not entirely sure what she was going to say. When Joshua answered, she could hear the hesitation in his voice, but also the confusion. Ruth gently asked him if everything was all right, sensing that something had shifted in him. Joshua, still filled with the shame of his earlier reaction, tried to avoid the topic, but Ruth pressed on, her voice calm and soothing, urging him to tell her what had been bothering him. After a long pause, Joshua finally confessed. He told Ruth that he found her attractive, admitting that he had felt something he couldn't explain. There was silence on the line for a moment, and then Ruth, rather than being shocked, felt a wave of flattery wash over her. She had long believed that her beauty had faded, especially since Pastor Joseph had grown distant. But here was this young man, someone she had practically raised, telling her that he saw her as more than just a mother figure. Ruth's loneliness had been growing for years. Pastor Joseph, ever the devoted servant of the church, spent most of his time counseling others or preparing sermons, often leaving her feeling abandoned. Their marriage had become more of a partnership for the sake of appearances than a relationship filled with love and intimacy. Ruth hadn't been touched in months, and the attention Joshua showed her awoke a deep need in her that she had pushed aside for far too long. The next day, Ruth invited Joshua over to the house again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets as Joshua made his way to Ruth's home, his heart racing. He didn't know what to expect, but there was a sense of inevitability about what was going to happen. When he arrived, Ruth greeted him at the door with a soft smile. She led him inside, and the air between them felt different, charged with a tension that neither of them could ignore. As they sat in the living room, Ruth began talking, explaining how lonely she had felt in her marriage, how distant her husband had become. She didn't try to justify what was about to happen, but she wanted Joshua to understand that she, too, had been struggling with emotions she didn't fully comprehend. Joshua, filled with a mixture of guilt and desire, listened as Ruth spoke, feeling the weight of her words settle on his heart. Then, in a moment of vulnerability, Ruth leaned in and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, as though she was unsure whether she should proceed. But the connection between them was undeniable. That kiss quickly turned into something more, something neither of them could stop. Their affair began that night, a dangerous and secretive relationship that both knew was wrong but could not resist. For months, they met in secret, often in Ruth's home, when Pastor Joseph was away on church business. The excitement of being together, of sharing stolen moments, fueled their affair. But for Joshua, the guilt began to build. Raised with strict Christian values, he knew that what he was doing was not just wrong, but a deep betrayal of both the man who had been like a father to him and the church he had devoted so much of his life to. At night, Joshua would lie awake, thinking of the sermons Pastor Joseph had delivered about sin and temptation, feeling the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. Ruth, on the other hand, felt alive again. For the first time in years, she felt desirable, needed, and wanted. Joshua's youth and passion made her feel like she was reliving the days of her own youth. She convinced herself that what they had was love, that their connection was something special, something more than just an affair. She found ways to rationalize the wrongness of it all, telling herself that Joshua was an adult now, a man capable of making his own choices. But deep down, she knew that this couldn't last. By the fall of 2013, the weight of their actions had become too much for Joshua to bear. His guilt had grown unbearable, and one day he told Ruth that he could no longer live with the secret. He needed to confess. He couldn't continue betraying Pastor Joseph, a man who had given him so much, without facing the consequences. Ruth, upon hearing this, panicked. She knew that if Joshua told her husband, it would destroy everything: her marriage, her reputation, her place in the community. She begged Joshua not to confess, promising that they could stop, that they could go back to how things were before. But Joshua was resolute. He told her that he had to confess, no matter the cost. Ruth spent the following days consumed by fear. She couldn't let Joshua ruin her life. She couldn't let him destroy everything she had worked so hard to maintain. She realized that she had no choice. She had to stop him. On November 15th, 2013, Ruth invited Joshua over to her house one last time. She told him that she understood his decision, that she respected his need to confess, and that they could have one final dinner together before everything changed. Joshua, still conflicted but trusting Ruth, agreed. That evening, Ruth prepared a simple dinner, acting as though everything was normal. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing. She had laced Joshua's drink with poison, a substance she had carefully chosen to be quick but relatively painless. As they sat at the kitchen table, Joshua spoke of how he planned to confess to Pastor Joseph, explaining his guilt and his hope for forgiveness. Ruth listened quietly, watching as he slowly drank the poisoned wine, her heart pounding in her chest. It didn't take long for the poison to take effect. Joshua's face grew pale, his words slurring as he tried to continue speaking. He suddenly gripped the edge of the table, confusion and fear flashing across his face as his body weakened. Within minutes, Joshua collapsed to the floor, his breathing shallow, his life slipping away. Ruth stood over him, tears streaming down her face as she watched him die, knowing that there was no turning back now. As Joshua's body lay lifeless on the kitchen floor, Ruth felt a numbness settle over her. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. She had done what she felt she had to do. But as she stood there, looking down at the boy she had once cared for like a son, she realized that she had destroyed not only him, but herself as well. On the morning of November 16th, 2013, Henry Jacobs woke up with an uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Joshua had not returned home the previous night, and that was unlike him. Joshua was always responsible, never giving his father any reason to worry. Henry had tried calling him, but there was no answer. And as the minutes turned into hours, the fear settled in his gut. He knew something was wrong. By midday, Henry reported his son missing, his voice trembling as he described Joshua's last known whereabouts to the local authorities. The small-town police launched a search almost immediately. They combed through the streets, questioned neighbors, and searched the places Joshua frequented. Henry spent the entire night in agonizing worry, pacing his small living room, clutching his phone, hoping for any news that would bring his son home. But as the hours dragged on and the night grew darker, hope turned into dread. Joshua had disappeared without a trace, and the fear of never seeing him again weighed heavily on Henry's heart. 2 days later, on November 18th, 2013, the town was struck with the devastating news that no one was prepared for. A group of officers, following a lead, had found Joshua's body buried in a shallow grave in the woods behind the Anderson property. The discovery shocked the entire community. The police quickly cordoned off the area, and investigators began to piece together the gruesome details of what had happened. Joshua's body, though hastily buried, showed signs of poisoning, a finding that would soon lead investigators to uncover the chilling truth. Henry's world crumbled the moment the officers came to his door to deliver the news. The grief hit him like a wave, pulling him under into a suffocating darkness. His only child, the boy he had raised on his own after his wife's death, was gone. In those first moments of realization, Henry felt not just the pain of loss, but the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He had trusted Ruth Anderson, the woman who had cared for Joshua all those years, to be a mother figure to his son. He had never imagined that the woman he had known for so long could have anything to do with his son's death. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Joshua had been poisoned. Ruth Anderson, the last person to see Joshua alive, quickly became the focus of the investigation. The small town had always held Ruth in high regard. She was the wife of the pastor, a devoted member of the church, and someone who had spent years caring for the people around her. But beneath that veneer of respectability, there were secrets, dark, unsettling truths that no one had ever suspected. On November 20th, 2013, Ruth was brought in for questioning. She maintained her innocence at first, speaking calmly, denying any involvement in Joshua's death. She spoke of him as she always had, like a mother speaking of her child. But as the police pressed her for more details, her story began to unravel. It wasn't long before the investigators discovered there were traces of the poison in her home, evidence that tied her directly to Joshua's death. The police were relentless in their pursuit of the truth, and soon Ruth was backed into a corner, her lies exposed. The town was in shock when Ruth was arrested on November 22nd and charged with murder. The news spread quickly, and the community, once united in faith and trust, found itself divided. How could this have happened? Ruth, the pastor's wife, someone who had always seemed so kind, so nurturing, was now at the center of a scandal that rocked the very foundation of the town. As more details of the investigation came to light, the community learned the disturbing truth. Ruth had been having an affair with Joshua. The revelation sent fear and panic through the town. People whispered in hushed tones, unable to reconcile the image of the sweet, church-going woman with the predator who had preyed on a vulnerable young man. The affair, hidden for so long, had become the catalyst for Joshua's tragic end. For Pastor Joseph Anderson, the betrayal was too much to bear. The woman he had been married to for over 40 years had not only been unfaithful, but she had also taken the life of the boy he had treated as a son. He was devastated, unable to comprehend how Ruth, the woman he had loved and trusted, could have committed such a heinous act. The weight of the scandal was unbearable. And soon after Ruth's arrest, Pastor Joseph resigned from his position at the church. He couldn't face the shame that had fallen upon his family, and in a town where everyone knew each other, there was no escaping the whispers, the judgment, and the heartbreak. Henry Jacobs was left shattered. The grief of losing his son was compounded by the guilt of trusting the very woman who had taken Joshua's life. For years, he had relied on Ruth, believing that she was a second mother to Joshua. Now, he was haunted by the thought that he had unwittingly placed his son in the hands of someone capable of such betrayal. The memory of Joshua's laughter, his smile, and the promise of the future he would never have haunted Henry day and night. He found himself walking through an empty house, filled with reminders of the boy he had lost. The trial began in March of 2014. By then, the town had become a shadow of its former self. People who once gathered together for Sunday service now kept their distance, unsure of what to believe anymore. The courtroom was packed with familiar faces, members of the community who had once admired Ruth, now sitting in silence as the prosecution laid out the grim details of the case. The prosecution painted Ruth as a manipulative woman who had preyed on a young, vulnerable boy. They revealed the affair in excruciating detail, shocking the members of the town who had once trusted her. The defense attempted to argue that the relationship had been consensual, but it was clear to everyone in the room that Ruth had been the instigator. Joshua had been a confused, conflicted young man, and Ruth had used her position of authority to exploit his vulnerability. As the trial wore on, the emotional toll on both Henry and Pastor Joseph was evident. Henry sat in the back of the courtroom, his face etched with sorrow, while Pastor Joseph remained quiet, his once strong presence now diminished. Both men had lost everything: Henry, his only child, and Pastor Joseph, his wife, and the respect of the community he had served for decades. After 2 long weeks, the trial came to an end. On March 20th, 2014, Ruth was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with a heavy silence in the courtroom, broken only by the sound of weeping from some of the town's elders, who had once looked up to Ruth as a pillar of their community. Ruth was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The weight of her actions finally caught up with her as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her once proud figure now hunched with the burden of guilt. In the aftermath of the trial, the town was left in ruins. The community, once united in faith, was now divided by scandal and betrayal. Pastor Joseph, unable to bear the shame, left the town for good, disappearing from the lives of those who had once looked up to him. Henry, heartbroken and alone, mourned the loss of his son, haunted by the memories of what could have been. The town would never be the same again. The scars left by Joshua's death and Ruth's betrayal would linger for years, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most trusted of faces. This reminds me of a very similar case where a 65-year-old housewife's affair with a teenage neighbor's son ends deadly. Kindly take a look at this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on our daily updates.